All right, so the next section we're going to dive into, this is going to be a brief section. We're going to talk about American colonialism. For the next section, we're going to talk about Central and South American colonialism, and then the last section we're going to focus on is North American settler colonialism. But want to dive this. For now, just this section that we're going to talk about the Central and South American. We're just going to be a brief introduction to it, and we're going to dive deeper into this during the Latinx history of Latinx discrimination class. We'll talk about how this history relates directly to things that Latinx people are experiencing now today. But for this one, I just want to give a little bit of background on what happened in Central America and South America, and then we're going to, like I said, end the class in North America. So I want to play again Geohistory. Did another really great video on kind of the European conquest of the Americas through their map, their animated map. So I want to I'll play this really quickly. Just give everyone kind of a background of just kind of like a foundation of knowledge, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into some things.
In the middle of the 15th century, these were roughly the territories known to Europe. Despite the discovery 500 years earlier of a tip of North America by a Viking tribe, the continent and the tens of millions of souls that populate it are still unknown to European powers. For centuries, Europe is mainly oriented towards Asia, from where silk, spices, and other goods originate. Trade routes from China and East Indies are lucrative for those who control them. By weaving a maritime network across the Mediterranean Sea, the powerful republics of Venice and Genoa dominate trade in Europe. But the monarchies of the Iberian Peninsula aim to break this monopoly and set off in search of new routes. More efficient ships are built, boosting exploration of the Atlantic Ocean. A native of the Republic of Genoa, Columbus lived in Lisbon. The young navigator dreams of discovering a new road to Cathay and Cipango, found in present-day China and Japan. According to his calculations, the territories are close enough to attempt a crossing. He presents the project to the Portuguese king, who refuses to finance it, as the country focuses on the exploration of a route via Africa. Columbus then tries his luck with Spanish Catholic kings. After some hesitation, they eventually agree to fund the expedition. Christopher Columbus sets off on his voyage in 1492 as the head of 3 ships and a crew of 90 men. After 70 days of sailing, the expedition discovers an island in the Bahamian archipelago. The first encounter with the natives is peaceful and cordial. Convinced he found the East Indies, Columbus calls them Indians. For 3 months, he hops from island to island in search of Cipango. Upon his return to Spain, he is welcomed as a hero. He sets sail again the following year, this time with 17 ships, to establish a permanent settlement on the island of Hispaniola. La Isabela is created in honor of the Queen of Castile, with Columbus as governor. He continues to explore surrounding areas. To avoid wars in newly discovered lands, the Spanish and Portuguese kings meet and come up with a plan to share the territories. A meridian is defined, newly discovered lands towards west going to Spain and those in Portugal. Moreover, the Pope tasks Spanish kings with evangelizing the new territories. England also tries to reach Cathay, but from the north, leading it to discover new lands. For its part, Portugal, with Vasco da Gama, eventually succeeds in opening a new sea route to India. During the second expedition, Portuguese ships head westward to bypass strong sea currents, thereby discovering a new land located east of the meridian of Tordesillas. Colonies are quickly established there. In 1506, Christopher Columbus dies without knowing he had discovered a new continent. It is Amerigo Vespucci, another navigator who had traveled several times to the land, who first suggests that it's a new world. The continent is then named America after him. Around Hispaniola, explorers called the conquistadors set off to discover and conquer new land. Rapidly, the condition of the natives deteriorates. Lands are stolen, people are enslaved, and moreover, previously unknown diseases imported by Europeans spread through the continent and decimate populations. In Cuba, conquistador Hernán Cortés hears of a city called Tenochtitlan, a supposed city of gold. Having reached land during his expedition in search of the city, Cortés realizes he is in the Aztec Empire, which rules over surrounding territories and peoples. He takes advantage of the situation to propose or impose by force that the locals become part of the Spanish Empire. His strategy pays off. Cortés is guided by locals to their capital, where they receive a warm welcome. Just south of the continent, Ferdinand Magellan, seeking to go around the world, discovers a strait that would bear his name and enters the Pacific Ocean. The following year, war breaks out in Tenochtitlan. The Spanish and their allies impose a siege of 75 days around the capital. Moreover, a smallpox epidemic eventually exhausts the Aztec people, who surrender. Cortés enters the city and becomes the governor of New Spain. Spanish colonies cultivate local products previously unknown in Europe, such as maize, potato, tobacco, and cacao. These products, as well as gold and silver obtained from conquests and from mines, are exported to Europe. Settlements also take a religious turn with the arrival of the Franciscans, who wish to establish an even purer church than back home and baptize natives. Cortés now begins a conquest of the Mayan people. While further south, conquistador Francisco Pizarro hears of the supposedly rich Inca Empire. After several unsuccessful expeditions, he returns with an army in 1531. The Inca Empire is already weakened by smallpox, with the disease claiming the life of its emperor a few years earlier, sparking a succession war. During a meeting between Pizarro and the new emperor Atahualpa, the latter is captured and executed despite several tons of gold received for his release. French Protestants also tried to colonize the New World, but they failed because of existing Spanish and Portuguese forces and because of adverse climatic conditions and diseases. Eventually, more resources are allocated into colonization, and New France is founded in order to develop trade in fishing and furs. The English and Dutch quickly follow suit and settle along the coast. The colonies would face off many times, following the patterns of war taking place in Europe. Generally, the French ally with local tribes, while the English fight alongside the Iroquois. In the mid-17th century, the slave trade blows up. European ships go to Africa loaded with goods which are exchanged against slaves who are transported in harsh conditions to America, where they are exchanged against local products and gold. Slaves are then mainly used in plantations, while the ships returning to Europe sell American products at high prices. In 1763, New France lost the fourth and final intercolonial war. The colony then comes under control of the British, who cede a portion to Spanish territories in exchange for Florida. With war taking a financial toll on the United Kingdom, colonies are made to pay through new taxes. In response, 13 colonies rebel and declare independence. Thus begins a new war between the United Kingdom and these colonies, who are supported by France, Spain, and the United Province of the Netherlands. In 1783, the British are forced to recognize the independence of the United States. While Russia begins to establish settlements in northwestern coastal territories, Spain finds itself weakened because of a war against France. Colonies begin to proclaim independence, and Spain is quickly forced to withdraw and recognize the new states. Texas declares independence from Mexico and asks to join the United States, creating tension between the two countries. A war breaks out and swings to the advantage of the United States, who also seize California and New Mexico. Oregon is then shared between the British colonies and the United States. In 1867, the United States buys Alaska from Russia. In the South, the Mapuche are the last natives to have resisted attempts at colonization. However, Argentina and Chile launched the southern conquests in order to have access to both oceans. With the Mapuche defeated, the entire continent is conquered.
All right. And I really love geohistory. They do a really great job, doing the spatial awareness along with the chronological, timeline. Um, so we're just gonna have a couple of slides. We're not gonna spend too much time on, but like I said, we're gonna talk about Latin European colonization. We'll get a little bit deeper in another class. But for this one, we're just gonna we're kind of setting the context before we go up to North America. But Central and South American colonialization, I mean, it really started with Columbus. 1492, finds, thinks he's sailing to Asia, thinks he hits the East Indies, but instead he's looking for a westward passage, because again, Ottoman Empire kind of blocked the eastward trade route, so they're looking for a way around the Ottoman Empire. And he hits basically the Bahamas and the Caribbean islands. So he starts colonizing, Puerto Rico, Cuba, a lot of these different islands. And eventually, it's called the indigenous people are called Indians because for a long time they never really realized that they weren't in the Indian Ocean. They didn't realize that this was a new continent. And Columbus just, does horrific things. You really can't downplay like how awful of a guy and how awful it is that we have a holiday for this guy and we have statues and celebrate him. I mean, he enslaved thousands of natives. He, again, very much like King Leopold, he would cut people's hands off if they didn't meet their quotas for gold. Burn people alive. Fed babies. A lot of reports about feeding live babies to dogs. It's attacked dogs. Slaughtered men. It's just brutality of what he did, and all in the quest of trying to get as much gold as possible that he could ship back to Spain. He was one of the few people that like 100% committed, carried out 100% genocide. Like he completely wiped out the Arawaks in Haiti. Through his pure brutality. So we need to stop celebrating this person. We need to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Day and stop this. But then, so Spain, slowly over the next couple centuries, they'd start shipping in millions of Spanish people, migrate over, and they start slowly conquering. Really, it's a combination of a couple of things that they were able to conquer most of Central and South America. One of the biggest things was diseases, as well as kind of wiping out most of the resistance as they start using divide and conquer for the people who's left over. But as they start, they basically turn most of this territory into what's called encomienda system, which is basically like a feudal serfdom system where conquistadors are given large parts of land after they conquer this land, and then everyone in that land is basically treated like a serf, enslaved like a serf, but oftentimes much worse, where and they were careful not to call these people slaves, and they even had laws against enslaved indigenous, but I mean they definitely enslaved these people, and they forced them to work in mines, basically to death with like harsh quotas, for and lots of brutality. Millions of indigenous people died in these systems. And then, but Spain wasn't alone, but I mean, they did do a majority of Central and Southern, America were Spanish colonies. But Portugal did, because of that treaty that video talked about. Portugal, there was a line, some kind of longitude line, and everything on this side was just Brazil. So that allowed Portugal to colonize Brazil, but that's about as far as they went. And then British colonized a lot of the islands, the Caribbean islands, a lot of very, very profitable sugar plantations. France colonized Haiti and the West Indies. real important with Haiti. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why Haiti's, still struggling today is when they actually did revolt. It was the first, country that was established by slave rebellion. But in order to, keep France from coming back to invading them, they had to, they'd signed some agreement where they had to pay enormous amount of wealth to France, and they did that, for a very long time. So that impoverished the whole country really harshly. So when we look at Haiti, it's easy to be like, oh, that's just like a poor country that just happens to be poor. When in reality, that's a very intentional direct result of France. Why Haiti is so incredibly impoverished. And then not just French too. There was a lot of neocolonialism and as well American imperialism and things that definitely has really affected Haiti. So Spanish, like I said, they were able to conquer most of this stuff through the diseases. I mean, those diseases went ahead of them, and by the time they actually arrived to places to conquer, most of the resistance was killed. But they did also use like these huge divide and conquer methods, like the Aztec Empire in Mexico. I mean, they a lot of people that were under control of Aztec Empire were not happy about that Aztec leaders. So I mean, I read that they recruited like 200,000 soldiers that were willing to fight against the Aztec Empire to help conquer it. And same with Inca. We talked about this. Inca Empire was down in Peru. Like a place like Machu Picchu and all those places are all part of this like vast Inca Empire. And then, but the leader was killed by these diseases, as well as lots of other people in this country, in the Inca Empire. And then there was this huge war between his sons, and that's when Conquistador Pizarro just arrives, and he's able to align himself with one tribe and then kind of use them against each other. He captures one of the main leaders, and they're just able to, through divide and conquer, through diseases, through superior weaponry, and through a lot of brutality, that they're able to capture a majority of Central and South America. And we're going to throw a lot of different estimates out there. I mean, because they're just estimates, but one of them talked about how during the Central and South America, like 20 million indigenous people were killed during colonialism, or about 95% of the population. A lot of scholars actually refer to this as the American genocide, because so many indigenous people were killed. And then a big part of this was slavery. So they try to enslave a lot of the in comunidades systems. They try to enslave a lot of indigenous people, and they continue to enslave them for a long time. It was much cheaper than actually buying African slaves or African enslaved people. But eventually, a lot of particularly certain areas like Portugal was one of the biggest receivers of African slaves, like 5 million. So 12 million total, and then like 5 million went to Brazil, and almost another 5 million went to the Caribbean or West Indies. And then 500,000 went to the colonies up in America, and then some went to Central America and to the Inca Empire. But really, the vast majority went to Brazil and the West Indies. And then some actually went back to Europe. And that was because, there were mainly like, sugar plantations was the biggest one. I mean, there was a lot of, cash crop plantations that they were working on, but sugar plantations were by far the worst. So people, I mean, it was just such brutal environment, horrific conditions that, most, enslaved people only lasted about 3 years. So instead of like, creating these, improving conditions, they just, instead they kept on working people to death, knowing that they're making so much money, they can just keep on buying. And just millions of Africans were just, brutally killed in the Caribbean, and just made enormous amount of wealth for Europe. At the same time, in the Spanish territories, that they imposed what was called the colonial caste system, or it was called Casa. It was essentially this racialized caste system where they had, if people are born in Spain, you know, basically it had privileges and benefits for more European or more white people, and then disadvantages for indigenous or African people. So if you're born in Spain, you're at the top, and you can probably get any job in the government. You were probably part of the colonial governments. You know, like you could do anything you want, and you're very privileged. And then they had Creoles, who were Spanish born in the New World, so they were kind of step below, where they still had a lot of advantages, but they were starting to, you know, there's some discrimination, you know, some, you know, just that you weren't born in the home country, kind of, you know, nepotism. And then you had, you know, kind of a lot of mixed blood, where you had the mestizos, where this is where mixed blood with European and indigenous people, and then mulattoes is with European and African people. And this was, you know, I mean, a lot of this was done mutually, but a lot of this was done not mutually, you know, and that's something we need to recognize. A lot of this, you know, occurred through a lot of systematic rape. And this was, and that's one of the reasons why they, you know, they were discriminated against, because you know, because a lot of this was done so much with rape, and that it was considered illegitimate, you know, but also there was a racialized, you know, kind of an anti-indigenous, anti-black racism behind this as well. So if you were, you know, in the mixed blood, you started to experience a lot more discrimination. You couldn't get you don't get so high in the government, you know, there was a lot less opportunities for you. And then on the bottom was indigenous people and black enslaved people, and there was very little opportunity, an enormous amount of discrimination. So that's really important to understand, that this you know, became this, you know, Latin America now that is a mixture of all of this, and this is directly tied to the colonial times, you know, and to colonial rule. This is an outcome of colonialism. And then eventually there was most of these countries, particularly in the 1800s, there's a few, you know, in 1900s, but mainly in the 1800s, majority of these countries you become independent, and they start declaring independence and start overturning, you know, mainly Spanish rule, but also Brazil and French and other places as well. So most of these colonial independence movements are actually fought by the colonial elite. So they're fought by these, you know, the Spanish-born or the Creoles, and that shows too, because a lot of these countries, you know, even after their independence, you know, that they were, you know, it was very much like America, the indigenous people and the black people, and many of the enslaved people still experienced an enormous amount of discrimination. There were so many of these countries continued slavery for you know, decades afterwards, much like, you know, United States did. So it was very similar to the United States, if you think about these colonial, you know, subjects, you know, where our independence war was you know, it was fought, you know, it was elites. It was a war, you know, that was, you know, fought, you know, instigated by the elites, you know, and fought mainly by, you know, they tried to, you know, by mainly white people, or white Europeans. So it's a very similar to, you know, to how a lot of these other, you know, independence movements played out. And then because of that, we still see the, you know, enormous amount of effects, you know, when the new governments, you know, appeared, they're much like the United States. They still, you know, they still preserved a lot of these colonial institutions, from slavery to you know, anti-indigenous and anti-black racism to colorism, you know, to like benefiting, you know, the whiter you are, the more, you know, benefits and less discrimination that you experience. And that's something that's still felt today. So it's really important to understand that it wasn't just like indigenous Mexicans overthrowing Mexico. It was like, it was these colonial elites that fought many of these wars, and then fought to maintain power through a lot of the colonial institutions afterwards. But many of these countries never actually got their independence. You know, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, you know, British Virgin Islands, you know, Bermuda, all these countries are still under, you know, colonial rule. We call them territories, and came up with a whole bunch of different names and stuff. But ultimately, they're still under colonial rule, and they still experience a lot of bad things because of that. All right, so I'm gonna end this. I'm gonna play this quick video from the count. So Bartolomé de las Casas, he was he was eventually like a priest, but he didn't start out one, but he came over as he came over as one of the Spanish colonies. I want to say like some kind of, I don't forget exactly what he was a part of, but he eventually became a priest, and then he wrote this short account about the destruction of the Indies. So this was he wrote about just like the brutality and the horrific things that he was seeing throughout the Caribbean and the West Indies under Spanish rule. So I'm just going to play a quick little excerpt from his book, The Short Account of Destruction of the Indies, to kind of give you a reality of what it was like during Spanish colonialism.
The Indies were discovered in the year 1492. 49 years have passed since the first settlers penetrated the land, the first being the large and most happy isle called Hispaniola, perhaps the most densely populated place in the world. There must be close to 200 leagues of land on this island, and all the land so far discovered is a beehive of people. It is as though God had crowded into these lands the great majority of mankind. And all of the infinite universe of humanity, these people are the most guileless, the most devoid of wickedness and duplicity, the most obedient and faithful to their native masters and to the Spanish Christians whom they serve. And because they are so weak and complacent, they are less able to endure heavy labor and soon die of no matter what malady. Yet into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days, killing, terrorizing, afflicting, torturing, and destroying the native peoples, doing all this with the strangest and most varied new methods of cruelty, never seen or heard of before. And to such a degree that this island of Hispaniola, once so populous, having a population that I estimated to be more than 3 millions, has now a population of barely 200 persons. Their reason for killing and destroying such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. It should be kept in mind that their insatiable greed and ambition, the greatest ever seen in the world, is the cause of their villainies. And also those lands are so rich and felicitous, the native people so meek and patient, so easy to subject, that our Spaniards have no more consideration for them than beasts. No, for thanks be to God, they have treated beasts with some respect, I should say instead like excrement on the public squares. The Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands. They took up arms, but their weapons were very weak and of little service in offense and still less in defense. The Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. They attacked the towns and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. They made some low, wide gallows on which they hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13 in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, then set burning wood at their feet and thus burned them alive. When tied to the stake, the cacique, or chieftain, Hatway, a very important noble, was told by a Franciscan friar about the God of the Christians and of the articles of faith, and he was told what he could do in the brief time that remained to him in order to be saved and to go to heaven. The chieftain, who had never heard any of this before, asked the Franciscan friar if Christians all went to heaven. When told that they did, he said he would prefer to go to hell.
All right. So the island that he was talking about, Hispaniola, eventually became Haiti and Dominican Republic island. But all right. So I'm gonna